Okay, I'm turning off my microphone whenever you're ready.
All right. Good morning. My name is Justin Jackson, Director of Compliance for the Community Development Administration, and I'm here today with Community Development Supervisor Tayo Apawape. And today is our final capacity building workshop for the 2022 CDBG funding cycle. Thank you again for taking your time to join us. For today's workshop, we will cover two topics, those being eligibility, and then there will be a presentation on best practices that will provide additional information for those applying for 2022 CDBG funding. Just a reminder to all that the RFP for the 2022 CDBG funding cycle is available on the City of St. Louis Community Development Administration website, as well as the slides from all of our capacity building training workshops this year, including today's. So at the moment, I will turn the presentation over to Tayo. She will go ahead and start us off.
All right, thank you, Justin. Let me share my screen. Good morning, everyone. Let me scroll up to the top. For some reason, I feel like, okay, sorry about that. So as Justin mentioned before, we are going over two presentations today. So this presentation will briefly cover CDBG's background and explain how national objectives and eligible activities are the two cornerstones in designing CDBG eligible programs. For the sake of time, I will not review every slide. Most of the slides I am skipping are helpful exercises and examples to gauge your understanding of the materials. I strongly recommend that you review those slides at your leisure. There are 4 steps in designing CDBG eligible programs. First is identifying an idea or concept. Next, determine if that idea or concept meets a national objective and is an eligible activity under CDBG regulations. And lastly, determine the cost reasonableness of the program by following financial principles as detailed in 2 CFR Part 200, as discussed yesterday in our financial management presentation. The CDBG program was enacted as part of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. As one of the longest running HUD programs, the CDBG program gives annual grants on a formula basis to over 1,200 municipalities and other units of government throughout the country to develop viable urban communities. The goals of the CDBG program are to provide decent, affordable housing, provide a suitable living environment, and expand economic opportunities, principally for low and moderate income persons. Now, throughout this presentation, I will refer to low and moderate income persons as LMI or low mod. These are all synonymous. For an activity to qualify under CDBG, it must meet a program goal. A program goal refers to meeting your numerical goals. For example, if you say you're going to assist 50 low to moderate income persons, LMI persons, once your contract is complete, you must do so. The activity must also meet a national objective and be an eligible activity under CDBG regulations. I will go more into depth about these last two items, starting with CDBG national objectives. The CDBG national objectives can be found on 24 CFR Part 570.208. Determining if your idea or concept meets a CDBG national objective is a second step in designing a CDBG eligible program. There are 3 national objectives. The first one is the prevention or elimination of slums and blight. The second one pertains to activities that address an urgent threat to health or welfare. The third one pertains to activities that primarily benefit low and moderate income persons. If an activity does not fall into at least one of these national objectives, then the activity is ineligible for CDBG funding. Elimination of slum and blight is not commonly used as a national objective. It must include activities designated to address the deteriorated physical environment. Eligible activities under this national objective include, but are not limited to, acquisition and clearance of blighted properties, installation of a park or other public improvement facility, and treatment of a toxic area in order for it to be redeveloped later. The service area must be defined and meet the definition of slum blight under state or local law. Typically, an area is deemed blighted through an ordinance. You can also reference a blighting study that is relevant to the service area. Either way, you must document that a substantial number of buildings within the service area, at least 25% or more, have visible signs of deterioration, or the area's public improvements within the service area are all generally in a state of deterioration. It is important to note that the area must be deemed blighted prior to submitting your application. Urgent need is another national objective. It is used in emergency situations to meet a serious and immediate threat to the health and welfare of the community. The threat must be recent or recently became urgent, generally within 18 months preceding the agency certification. Some people may be asking themselves, it sounds like my COVID-related activity that I want to be funded with CDBG may qualify under the national objective of urgent need, but this may not necessarily be the case. To qualify under urgent need, the organization must avoid what is called a duplication of services. Generally speaking, this means that the agency must document that the CDBG funding for the proposed activity is the option of last resort, or that there are no other funding sources available to carry out that activity. This is a tall order, given that there are many stimulus monies available specifically geared to address COVID-19. Furthermore, at least 70% of the CDBG expenditures must benefit low to moderate income persons. Because the proposed activity is not based upon a person's income, but rather a situation at large, the activity would count against that 70% threshold, making it even less likely for CDA to fulfill our federal obligation in serving primarily low to moderate income persons. In short, it is rare to qualify under urgent need, even if your activity prepares for, prevents, and or responds to the pandemic. Your activity may more likely fit under another national objective, which is activities that benefit low and moderate income persons or LMI persons. Activities benefiting low and moderate income persons is the most important and most common national objective. As I mentioned before, statute requires at least 70% of all CDBG expenditures benefit low mod persons. Under this national objective, records must document the low to moderate income status of each participant. There are 4 ways activities can meet the low and moderate income national objective. They are those activities that serve a limited clientele based upon an area of benefit, involve employment, namely jobs, and involve housing. Activities that serve a limited clientele, or LMC, can qualify based upon nature and location, presumed benefit, or family size and income. CDA requires that all limited clientele programs utilize intake forms to determine eligibility. Qualifying as nature and location is not very common and must be approved by CDA in advance. An example of qualifying as nature and location would be a daycare center that is located in a public housing development that exclusively serves public housing residents. In this situation, it can be automatically assumed that given the nature and location of the activity only serves low to moderate income persons. A more common subcategory of activities benefiting low to moderate income persons are activities that are presumed to benefit low to moderate income persons. Through rigorous data collection, HUD has determined that certain populations are highly likely and therefore presumed to be low to moderate income. If your activity qualifies under this subcategory, your activity must exclusively serve one or more of the populations within the presumed group. The presumed populations are the elderly, meaning persons who are 62 years of age and older, severely disabled adults, abused children, battered spouses, homeless persons, illiterate adults, persons with AIDS, and migrant farm workers. A classic example of a program that would qualify under presumed benefit is a senior Meals on Wheels program. Another example is a domestic shelter that exclusively houses abused children and battered spouses. Qualifying under family and income is the most common national objective for most public service activities. These activities include, but are not limited to, daycare centers, youth services for after-school programming ages 6 to 18, summer programming for at-risk youth, job readiness training for ex-offenders, food pantries, and low-income tax assistance. Agencies must have documentation that at least 51% of all participants are low to moderate income. CDA will only pay for LMI persons, even though the person may have non-LMI individuals. If by the end of the contract year, the percent of LMI individuals served are less than 51%, then the agency must repay CDBG funds. Moreover, if you fail to document the LMI status of the participants, you will have to do the same. So that you do not have to pay back funds, you should have a clear understanding as to what is a low to moderate or LMI person. An LMI person is a member of a family having income equal to or less than the limit established by HUD based upon the size of the person's family. HUD's limit is based upon 80% of the area median income, or AMI, of a family. A family is defined as all persons living in the same household who are related by blood, marriage, or adoption. So two people who are friends with each other living under the same household are each considered to be a one-person family under this definition. Here is a table of the 2021 income limits for the city of St. Louis. Up top, the table is numbered 1 through 8, representing the number of people in a family. On the most left-hand column, are the income limits for being up to 30% AMI, characterized as being extremely low income, between 30% and 50% AMI, characterized as being low income, and the income limit between 50% and 80% AMI, which is characterized as being moderate income. Based on this table, in order for a family size of 4 to qualify for a program, their gross annual income cannot exceed $67,900. Adult children 18 years and older who continue to live at home with their parents are considered to be part of the family, and their income must be counted. A dependent child living outside of the home, such as students living in a dormitory or other student housing, is considered to be part of the family, even though that person is living somewhere else. CDBG differentiates between a household and a family. It is therefore important that your procedures, forms, and so on utilize the correct definition. Public service programs and almost all non-housing activities typically use family, while any housing-related activity typically uses household. The key difference between a household and family is that a household consists of everyone living in the same housing unit, regardless of whether or not they are related to each other. If this is still not clear, I would strongly recommend going through slides 23 through 25, which provide examples to help differentiate between a family and a household. When applying for CDBG funding, if you're applying for a public service, public improvement, or any other non-housing related activity, persons served would be based upon family. However, any persons assisted under housing activities, such as minor home repair or first-time homebuyer services, it would be based upon household. I'm skipping these slides. Low moderate income area benefit, or LMA, is the second subcategory that assists persons who are low to moderate income. LMA activities must have the following. Number one, boundaries must be clearly defined via census tracts or by single or multiple neighborhoods. Number two, the service area must be at least 51% low to moderate income. You will determine this by using census data. Number three, the area must be primarily residential. You can determine this using Geo St. Louis. The website is on this slide. Number four, activities must benefit all residents of the service area. And number five, the service area must be reasonably defined. For example, do not define your service area by wards, since HUD shuns the use of identifying areas via political affiliations. Defining your service area exclusively outside of the city limits is another example of an ill-defined service area. Low moderate income jobs, or LMJ, is the third subcategory that assists persons who are low to moderate income. In order to meet this criteria, activities must create or retain permanent jobs, and 51% of the jobs created or retained must be available to or held by LMI persons. Please note that jobs counted are based upon a full-time equivalent basis, FTE, which is the same as working 40 hours per week. For every one FTE permanent job created or retained, $35,000 of CDBG funds must be used. For example, if you're awarded $75,000 in CDBG funding, your agency must create or retain free FTE jobs. Failure to satisfy job requirements will result in payback of CDBG funds. Low moderate income housing, or LMH, is the fourth subcategory that assists persons who are low to moderate income. This is the only low mod national objective for housing activities. To meet the housing national objective, structures must be occupied by low to moderate income households. Remember, we made this distinction earlier between a family and a household. Family counts all blood relatives in a unit, while household counts everyone in a unit regardless of relationships. Typically, housing activities include homeowner rehabilitation, rental acquisition and rehab, homebuyer assistance programs. Here is a summary of the CDBG national objectives. I covered slums and blight, a national objective to address a physically distressed area that is typically blighted through an ordinance or a blighted study. Urgent need, a national objective to address emergency situations that has to document that CDBG funding is the option of last resort. I also covered the national objectives that are related to serving low to moderate income individuals, which include low mod area benefit or LMA activities that service an area that is primarily residential and primarily low to moderate income. Low mod jobs or LMJ activities require the creation or retention of jobs for low to moderate income persons. And low mod housing or LMH is a national objective that is strictly for housing related activities targeted for LMI homeowners, first-time home buyers, or renters. I also covered 3 ways to meet the low mod limited clientele or LMC national objective. They are nature and location, in which the nature and location clearly illustrates that the activity will primarily target LMI persons. Presumed benefit, in which persons served under a presumed population, namely elderly, severely disabled adults, abused children, battered spouses, homeless persons, illiterate adults, persons with AIDS, and migrant farm workers. And the most common method of meeting a national objective is by family size and income, where you must document that at least 51% of all participants are low to moderate income. Next, I will go over CDBG eligible activities from the regulations 24 CFR 570.201. This is the third step in designing a CDBG eligible program. CDBG funds can only be used for activities that fall under an authorized category of basic eligibility. It is critical that proposed activities must be properly classified and adequately documented. If not, there will be repayment of CDBG funds. Every eligible program must have an associated code demarcating that that program is carrying out an eligible activity. CDA inputs this code, known as the matrix code, for each program into the Integrated Disbursement Information Systems, or IDIS. IDIS is a web-based database where CDA reports to HUD activity eligibility and outcomes and carries out financial transactions between HUD and the City of St. Louis. HUD has published a National Objective Matrix Code Analysis Table to determine eligibility. I will go over this table in an upcoming slide. The activity must also be listed as a priority in the most recent consolidation plan. A list of priorities is located in the RFP. To qualify for CDBG funding, programs must meet a national objective and be an eligible activity. Examples of eligible activities include acquisition of real property, clearance and demolition, rehabilitation of housing, construction of public facilities, microenterprise assistance, public improvements such as streets and sidewalks, public services, economic development, home ownership assistance, and planning and capacity building. Regulations expressly prohibit the following activities. Number one, buildings for conduct of government, such as city hall improvements. Exceptions are community centers. Number two, general government expenses, such as trash pickup and operating the city's tax collection department. Number three, political activities, such as costs related to political campaigns and get out the vote drives. The most common eligible activity is public services. Under this category, CDBG funds may be used to provide public services, including labor, supplies, materials, and other costs, provided that each of the following criteria is met. The public service must be either a new service or a quantifiable increase in the level of a service, and the total amount of allocated public service funding cannot exceed the city's public service cap. Regulations state that the public service cap is 15%. However, CDA is grandfathered in at 19%. Public service activities include, but are not limited to, energy conservation counseling and testing, childcare, healthcare, job training, recreation programs, education programs, public safety services, services for seniors, drug abuse counseling and treatment, and services for homeless persons. Now I'm going to skip these slides that provide examples of various types of public service activities. And I'll talk about public facilities and improvements. Under public facility and improvement categories, CDBG funds may be used by the grantee or nonprofit for the following activities: acquisition, construction, reconstruction, rehabilitation, or installation of public improvements or facilities, except for buildings of general conduct of government. Facilities must be open to the public, and the improvements and facilities must be publicly owned or owned by a nonprofit. As mentioned in previous presentations, if you're interested in applying for public facilities and improvements, also known as construction activities, please review the presentation on organizational requirements, which have been posted to the CDA website. CDA has also added questions to the application specific to construction activities. Okay. I'm skipping these examples of public facilities, which you can look at your own leisure. And I'll focus on tips in determining eligible activities. First tip is to refer to the list of priorities on the RFP to determine viable activity options. Second tip is to use the HUD-provided National Objective Matrix Code Analysis. So I can click on that. And let's say our organization is wanting to do a childcare program. Yeah, let's see, it should be. And the matrix code is 05L, page 7. And here oops, that's not the right one. Childcare services, pardon me. And so it gives me a summary of what that activity is. And this one is for generally under, or children generally under the age of 13. I believe 05D is any child above the age of 13. The other tip is to use the HUD provided national objective / matrix code analysis. Now, this looks intimidating, but I'm going to explain it. So right here, you have the matrix code key. As we were looking at before, we were looking at 05D, youth services. And on the other side, we have the national objective codes. So this looks intimidating, but some of these we already covered. LMA, these are variations of LMA activities. LMA stands for low mod area. LMC, this is for limited clientele, variations off of limited clientele. LMH, low mod housing, a variation of that. LMJ, low mod jobs, variations on that. These are variations of slum and blight, and URG is urgent need. And if you do not remember all of that, at the very bottom, it tells you there's a key. And any box with an N indicates that the national objective is not allowed. So let me go back to my example of 05. O5L, child care services. Let's see if I can even get it. Okay, and so these first three options are not allowed. The first one that's allowed, that is LMC, so limited clientele. Other option is a version of LMC. Let's see. And up here, slum blight and urgent need. So as I mentioned before, urgent need, slum and blight are rarely used. So most likely, the way to meet the national objective would be under LMC, and it would not be a presumed benefit unless you were specifically targeting abused children. And so the best option for this would be family size and income, where at least 51% must be low to moderate income. So this is where I will conclude my presentation. The slides I did not cover, as I mentioned before, provide helpful examples and short quizzes to gauge your understanding of the materials, which you should review in your own time. Let me see if there are any questions about this presentation before Justin covers the best practice presentation. Doesn't look like. Oh, there might be one here. There are no questions, so I am going to have Justin take over.
Okay, thank you, Tayo.
You're welcome.
So for today's best practices presentation, we will highlight some areas that are beneficial for those who are completing applications for the 2022 round. Please remember that both presentations are available on the City of St. Louis Community Development Administration website for further reference. So there will be 3 parts of this presentation today regarding best practices. The first part will be a brief review of what we call common RFP mistakes that we see on an annual basis that we just want to make everyone aware of before moving forward. The next section will be a review of sections of the RFP. Now, we already had an RFP workshop where we walked through some general areas of the RFP, but we will be looking at some more specifics as it relates to narrative that you'll see in the RFP and give a little bit more breakdown of some of those areas. And then lastly, there'll be a period for questions and answers. Ten common CDBG RFP mistakes. So I'll leave that on the screen while I'm going through things. But the biggest mistake would be not following instructions. And the reason that's number one is because the RFP is very detailed. And oftentimes we look for ways to try to condense things, and we try to not make things so cumbersome and tedious. But there are instances where there is certain types of information that we need in order to clearly understand what an agency is trying to do or what they're proposing to do, which results in an RFP that is pretty detailed in terms of explaining eligible activities, explaining areas of focus, asking the questions about your agency, what you currently do, what you plan on doing, what's your history with these respective projects. But even with that being said, sometimes there are areas that are missed, or there's just a misunderstanding of what's being asked. So I would recommend that everybody, make sure that you take some time, look at the RFP, make sure that you look at each question, or whomever is going to be completing the RFP, look at each question and fill out those questions completely. Number 2, making assumptions. By this, we mean when you apply for CDBG funding, we want you to be clear on what it is that you're trying to do. We want you to clearly communicate to us what your program is, what you plan to do. More detail is always better. So it's we're looking to see that you have kind of your plan, your framework already specified from A to Z. So we don't want agencies to make assumptions about what they think they would do, or how things would turn out, or how they ideally would hope for things to turn out. So we want to make sure that agencies are submitting applications that are realistic, they're reasonable in their costs, and they're not so far off in what their expectations are that that the application won't be able to be successful. Number 3, not reviewing your own proposal in advance of submission. This actually happens a lot. Sometimes there are situations where maybe the person who creates an account in eGrams is not the author of the application. Maybe there's multiple parties that are working on pieces of the application, which sometimes happen, and that's definitely understandable. But ultimately, when it boils down to the last day and the submission of the application, ultimately your executive director and or your project director should have thoroughly reviewed the application from top to bottom, and they should be aware of all aspects of the application in the event that there's questions about the application or there's something that needs to be clarified. Number 4, not fully demonstrating the need. It's often, we often receive applications, for a variety of programs, but CDBG funding is in response to individuals of a low to moderate income. So it's the responsibility of the applicant to make sure that they demonstrate properly that the service that they're performing or that they're wanting to perform is actually needed in that respective area. Sometimes what is suggested may not necessarily be needed, but just may be preferred, which is somewhat different when it comes to evaluating the application. But if there's an area of town, or if there's a situation or a project where the need is visible and it's clear, it's important to make sure that you capture that and include that in your presentation, not your presentation, but your application. Number 5, not fully explaining program design. This goes back to the detail that you want to provide in your application in each respective section. We want you to provide a detailed description of your program, not so much where you explain the entire history of your organization, or not so much going in that direction, but also at the same time not being so vague just to say that we will provide assistance to businesses in the community. What type of businesses will you be assisting? How many? What exactly does assistance look like? What is the number associated with whatever service that you will provide? How do you quantify that? So making sure that you can fully explain your program design and how it will be carried out by you is very important in your application. Number 6, and in a lot of instances, this may be one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, not meeting a national objective or eligible activity. If your application does not meet a national objective, it will not be considered for CDBG funding. We are required to ensure that all applicants that receive funding meet a national objective. So those 3 areas are, they were mentioned earlier by Tayo, and they're referenced in the beginning of the RFP, and you'll constantly hear CDA putting emphasis on those 3 national objectives and making sure that you meet one of those national objectives. Underneath those objectives are eligible activities. Within the RFP, you'll see narrative regarding the national objective, and then you'll see narrative regarding which eligible activities are underneath those national objectives. So really take your time and take a look at those areas and know what you're focusing on before you submit your application. Number 7, lack of realistic outputs and objectives. So outputs and objectives are very crucial to the budgeting aspect of your program, how we reimburse you. CDA needs to be able to reimburse CDBG recipients or CDBG funded recipients based off of what they do. And your outputs and objectives need to be clear and quantifiable, like I mentioned earlier. Just making, oftentimes we see outputs that are vague and they're not descriptive enough, which requires either more conversations or, there's an inevitable delay in the contract being executed because there's just not a clear distinction of what the outputs and objectives are. And in some cases also, on applications, if the outputs are just too vague and non-descriptive, that the application itself can be denied from the beginning. Number 8, not making a reasonable ask. We put so much emphasis and concentration on making sure that your costs are reasonable and realistic, but there are situations and there is a chance that you can come in too low in terms of what you're requesting funding for what you're trying to do. There is a minimum award amount associated with requesting funds. So if you're trying to do a particular project and a reasonable range of cost for this project is, one range, and you come in at at an amount that's lower than that, so low that, we even look at your project and begin asking questions in terms of, are you requesting enough resources to carry out your project? So just make sure that you have a reasonable ask on that end. And that also applies in the opposite perspective also. Sometimes some requests are very, very broad. I think sometimes applicants will, aim for the ceiling, so to say, and, have maybe a let them tell us no to our request type of mentality. But we keep everything as it was mentioned in our financial presentation yesterday, we keep everything in the mindset of a prudent individual. So if you're requesting funding for something, and we know that on average, this request is very much in excess of what you're asking, those same questions begin to come up, and those same types of considerations for, is this a reasonable ask, begin to be associated with your application. That may result in further questions being asked, or in some instances, just denying the application outright. Not taking advantage of bonus points. So there are areas of the RFP that we look to place emphasis on, particularly the geographic areas. We award bonus points if you are providing a service and or are located in those geographic areas. So although this does not apply to everyone, it is important that if you are in one of those geographic areas, that you're mindful of being in those geographic areas so that you can receive those points associated with those respective areas. And then lastly, not using all of the space provided. I will say that if there's a space for narrative or explanation, oftentimes we receive applications where the area where an explanation is requested is left blank. So if there's an area that we're requesting you to please explain your past history doing XYZ, please make sure that you fill that out. And we don't want to have to make guesses about or make assumptions about what you're trying to do with your application. We want you to be able to clearly tell us what you're trying to do and make it clear so that there's no assumptions needed on our end. So make sure that you're taking advantage of all the space provided. So on to a review of RFP sections. So making sure that you read the pages carefully to determine if your proposed activity fits a national objective and within program guidelines is crucial. As I mentioned earlier, if a proposed activity does not meet a national objective, it cannot be funded. You'll also see in the CDBG RFP priorities and eligible activities. One of the most important sections of the RFP is this area right here. The annual priorities for the city of St. Louis are identified. And as I mentioned earlier, if a proposed activity does not fit within an eligible priority or activity, it cannot be funded. Within the RFP, you will find a set of instructions and you will find an instruction sheet. We encourage everyone to use that as a checklist. And that's especially important because it identifies conditions that, if not met, will disqualify the applicants. There are a list of items that are required to go along with your application. So please make sure that you're referencing that instruction sheet. Read carefully how to follow the directions associated with the instructions. And remember that if you have a question regarding the application, questions will only be accepted via CDBG for the actual application up until August 13th. If you have a question regarding eGrams, if it's a technical question that you're dealing with, you have until August 27th to submit that question. And all questions are submitted via the email addresses that you see on the screen. Again, associated with the application CDBG at stlouis-mo.gov or egrams support at stlouis-mo.gov. As you're completing your RFP, remember that acknowledgement and certification is important, and make sure that you're reading carefully the respective sections of your application. So I mentioned earlier that your executive director and or your project director, whomever is the lead or the individual responsible for pushing that submit button in egrams, will need to make sure that all areas of the application are signed by authorized signers of the respective organization, whether that's the executive director, the board president, and or other designated persons. So while you're going through the RFP, one of the common mistakes that comes up is areas of additional support or additional areas of an agency that are outside of the application that need to be in place before you submit your application, such as making sure that your DUNS number is properly established and making sure that you don't have issues with sam.gov that may be outstanding and not resolved prior to proposal of submission. So make sure that periodically during your proposal, or ideally before, but those are things that you can be working on now. Make sure that you log on to sam.gov and do a search on your own organization to make sure that your status is current. Make sure that your registration is not close to expiring, and make sure that there's no issues with your DUNS number. Let me go back to that for just a second. What often comes up also is we'll get to the point in time where the application is due and there are still issues with someone's sam.gov status and or DUNS number. You need to make sure that all of these issues are resolved prior to the submission of your application. You need to have all of your supporting documents submitted along with your application to have a complete application evaluated by CDA. This is a screenshot of sam.gov. Most nonprofits are familiar with this screen right here, but this is what you will see if you have any issues or if you're just going to sam.gov to double check your status. But that's just placed in the PowerPoint as a reference. Regarding organizational narratives and backgrounds, this section of the RFP is about demonstrating organizational capacity and can showcase your organization. So this can significantly affect the organization's overall rating. So make sure that this is the part of the application where you will want to provide very clear and specific detail about your organization and what you plan to do. You'll see in bold and red, one of the common mistakes is providing too much or not enough detail. Sometimes we get applicants who will spend a large part of this section detailing the history of their organization, when they started, how long ago they started, but they won't provide the same amount of detail in terms of what it is that they're trying to do with their CDBG request. On the other end of the spectrum, there are just sometimes applications who are very general, who are very vague about what they're doing. They may just be, they may make general statements about the service that they're providing is very beneficial to low to income individuals in the city of St. Louis. And there are hundreds of people who benefit from this activity every year. Statements like that are just too vague and they don't provide enough detail in terms of what your agency is trying to do. So make sure that when your organizational narrative is provided, that it's specific and detailed, and it allows someone who's outside of your organization to see a clear picture of not only what you're trying to do, but that they can quantify what you're trying to carry out and accomplish. Some tips for your organizational narrative, specifically your organizational background. Proposed activities should match your organizational purpose and be reasonably related to the types of services currently provided. For example, a daycare that provides educational services to toddlers should not be requesting funding for an offender reentry service program. In the event that that does happen, though, you would need to, that agency would need to adequately explain the deviation in purpose and change in that type of service. So, we look at these applications and we look at, the capacity of the agency to be able to carry out the program, as well as the relatability of what the agency's focus is to what they're trying to do. And oftentimes we see situations, similar to this, where the scope appears to be in one direction, but the request is in another. So be persuasive in demonstrating your organizational capacity to administer the proposed activity or activities. Another tip is that all applicants should address all required licenses. For example, a majority of applications that we receive are nonprofits. And although a nonprofit doesn't have a traditional business license, they do have documentation from the city of St. Louis where they indicate that they are a nonprofit and that they're exempt from certain types of requirements that for-profit businesses are, at least in terms of license collecting situations or tax collecting information through the city of St. Louis. So you want to make sure that you have all of your documentation in place to support your respective area and make sure that information is included with your application. As far as the history of the grant administration associated with your organization, a letter of recommendation from a previous funder is required for organizations not funded by CDA. And in addition, it's optional for agencies currently funded by CDA. But if you are a new organization applying, you've never received funding from CDA, you definitely want to include a letter of support from an organization that can attest to funding that has been contributed to your organization. If you were funded by CDA in the past, some years ago, and not the immediate year prior, we recommend that you still include a letter of recommendation. So those letters can be very helpful and beneficial for you in terms of evaluating your application. Regarding personnel descriptions and resumes, please note that agencies are required to list all existing and proposed staff positions for the proposed activity. Both resumes and job descriptions are required. If a position is not filled by the submission date, a resume is not required. However, a job description still is. Also, remember that if the to-be-hired position requires compliance with equal opportunity employment, CDA approval for costs is necessary in order for CDA approval is necessary for those costs to be CDBG eligible. So, again, this just goes back to making sure that you provide the description of what you're trying to do, making sure that in terms of equal employment opportunity, making sure that any positions within your agency are properly advertised and that everyone has an equal opportunity to be made aware of the position that's available. Common mistakes: not submitting both job descriptions and resumes when required, and not including all staff involved in the administration, management, and or operation of the proposed CDBG activities. So you really want to identify and capture, everyone in your organization who will be within arm's reach of CDBG funds, even if their position is not directly supported by CDBG funding. For example, even though CDBG funds may not be used to pay the CFO or the accountant of your respective agency. The position is involved in managing CDBG activities. So you will need to make sure that you provide that information to us. Lastly, one of the common mistakes is adding subcontractors to this section. So instead, what you should be doing is stating the name, title, and salary underneath section 7, which is proposed CDBG activity budgets, and under the line item contractual professional services, since these are not employees of your organization. Here's a quick tip for egrams. Your organizational narrative, personnel description, and resumes. Information from this section will carry over to the more detailed personnel section later in the application. Regarding financial management, some of this information was covered in our financial management presentation yesterday, but just as a follow-up, please note that you'll be required to provide a copy of the most recently submitted IRS Form 990 for the organization. Below, you'll see the dates for deadlines for those respective filing dates regarding your 990, but a common mistake is not attaching the approved, if you haven't filed your 990 by the above indicated timeframes, you will need to provide information regarding whether or not you've received an extension. So if you have received an extension in terms of filing that form and you don't attach the documentation to support the date which your updated extension date, that can become an issue with evaluation of your application. Another tip regarding financial management, please ensure that you demonstrate your organization's financial management system and internal controls that will lend assurance to your ability to properly manage federal funding. Inadequate answers can significantly affect your rating under the agency financial qualifications ratings category. Eventually, all agencies that are funded with CDBG funding receive a fiscal monitoring. So initially, we want to look for, and we want to ensure that your financial controls are in place, or your internal controls are in place rather, that your financial management system is healthy. So common mistakes are not providing detail to support sufficient segregation of major accounting functions within your organization, and not expanding on board of directors oversight of your organization's financial matters. So if there is, whatever the framework of your organization's financial structure is, you'll definitely need to communicate that in your organization so that if certain approval is needed after decisions are made in order to move forward with certain financial approvals, if dual signatures are needed for certain financial activity to be carried out, you want to make us aware of those things and make it clear how your agency operates. Regarding audit requirements, please make sure that you include a copy of your most recently completed single federal audit. The single federal audit threshold is $750,000 for an agency, meaning that an agency that receives more than $750,000 in federal funding is required to complete a single federal audit. So the audit reports must be filed with the Federal Audit Clearinghouse 9 months after an organization's fiscal year end date. So that is something that we look for, and we want to make sure that if you're required to have that audit, that you've completed the audit and completed it within the proper time frame. To assist with that, make sure that you describe how your organization will ensure compliance with a single federal audit, and to familiarize yourself with the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards, which is 2 CFR Part 200, Subpart F of HUD regulations. So a common mistake is not providing detail to support sufficient knowledge of the audit process, including budgeting the cost of the audit, procurement and selection of an audit firm, the timely completion of submission of the audit report. In the event that any findings were associated with your most recent audit, please make sure that you describe whether or not these findings have been resolved. Make sure that you provide a brief description of each finding, including question costs and steps taken to resolve the issue and the current status of the findings, if any. So not providing sufficient detail of the deficiencies or concerns noted in the audit report can be an issue, and make sure that you just let us know if something came up in your audit, what steps is your agency taking to resolve that, or has the situation been resolved altogether? Regarding your annual and proposed operating budgets, the tip is that if you categorize all your funding sources and expenses for the entire agency by line item descriptions on the form, it paints a clearer picture for us to see where your funding sources come from and where they're being applied, and it helps us better understand your overall organizational structure. One common mistake is not including the fiscal year beginning and end dates. Your CDA award is based on a fiscal year beginning January 1 and ending December 31. If you have funding sources that are different from that CDA programmatic calendar year, you should definitely indicate that, and you should be specific about what funding sources are utilized throughout that calendar year. All right. CDBG, RFP, activity cover sheets. For organizations that are submitting more than one proposal, please know that your organization must submit separate proposals for each activity that is separate and distinct. Meaning, if an organization is requesting funding for example, an after-school program at more than one location, that organization can submit either 3 proposals, or they can submit 1 proposal inclusive of all the sites, since the activity, being an after-school program, is the same. If that organization is requesting funding for this if you have one organization and they're requesting funding for an after-school program, and they're requesting funding for a daycare center, which we consider those to be 2 separate activities, that organization would need to submit 2 separate proposals. They would not need to be included. They should not be included in one application because they're being submitted by the same agency, but you need to keep in mind the activity that's being requested. Another example of an agency maybe performing multiple services or multiple activities, if organization HIJ would like to request funding to rehab several of their rooms and provide a food pantry in the same building, that agency needs to submit 2 separate proposals. Again, those activities, although they're underneath the umbrella of one organization, they're considered to be 2 separate and independent activities. So they would need their own proposals. Here's a tip. Make sure that you check one priority and one eligible activity. So as we mentioned earlier, making sure that the priority that your application is in response to, as well as that activity is clearly identified. That's important for your organization to distinguish. And a common mistake, just overall with applications, is that the contact that is listed is not the primary contact person for the proposed activity. So please make sure, I kind of alluded to this earlier about making sure that your program director, who is responsible for pushing the submit button in eGrams, is aware of all aspects of the application and making sure that the proper persons for each activity is included in your application. Activity description and funding request. We mentioned this is very important. We mentioned this earlier about not being too vague, but at the same time providing enough description so that we know exactly what your agency is looking to accomplish. For example, XYZ after school program or ABC financial literacy program should be clearly indicated on your application in terms of what that program is trying to accomplish. Make sure that you're specific about the types of programs that are being carried out. Oftentimes we will see a multitude of activities that are trying to be placed under the umbrella of one particular agency, and the agency just has the same name. It will just say ABC agency and they're applying for this, or ABC agency and they're applying for that. But you want to make sure that the name of your program can be specifically tied to the application that you are submitting. So oftentimes this just really means, stating your agency and including after the agency's name, or underneath the agency's name, what type of program that that agency will be carrying out. The minimum amount requested, as I mentioned earlier, is, or I mentioned earlier that there is a minimum amount associated with CDBG funding. That amount is $25,000. So make sure that what you're requesting is realistic and reasonable. If your program, or if what is really needed to carry out that program is, 5 times that amount, and then you're requesting, only 25,000 or 1/5 of that total amount, you need to be clear in terms of what role that money will play in your application, or how it will be utilized. Here's some tips also. If funded, the name of the activity will be the project name on your contract. So this is why it's important, as stated earlier, to make sure that you state the name of the program so that it's clear in terms of what you're applying for. Again, if you're an agency and you're submitting more than one application, each application should be uniquely identifiable in its own right, in the event that both are awarded, or in the event that only one of multiple applications is awarded. Also, the name and activity must not include any political or religious references. So any type of association with any type of political constituents and or religious activity should not be included. Regarding the description of activity, work to be performed and services provided, your population served, this is very important. Please make sure that you clearly describe your program. You're hearing that over and over and over again because with CDBG funding regulations, we have to go to the utmost lengths to identify the who, what, when, and how of a project. If a program is not fully explained and it's not clear, it will be reflected in the score that your application receives. So your activity summaries and your mission statements, again, make them concise, but also descriptive at the same time. So one common mistake that we see is not including all addresses and locations for proposed activities. I think sometimes, there are situations where, maybe certain things haven't been completely identified, but you need to make sure that you've done your best in terms of identifying where your location is going to be and what you'll be doing at that location. And if you have multiple sites for proposed activities, where those locations are going to be. If you just simply say multiple locations throughout the city of St. Louis, that's just entirely too vague for us when we're reviewing your application. Multiple locations throughout the city of St. Louis could mean anywhere. We want you to be specific in communicating to us what your intention is and what you plan to do, where you plan to do it, when you plan to do it, and how you carry it out. So providing all that information up front is what is needed for a successful application. So some more information in regards to meeting a national objective. Make sure in your activity description that you take a look at the CDBG background narrative for the details on the national objectives. And if funded, remember that CDA will only reimburse for the low to moderate income participants in the activity. A lot of times you have facilities that are open to the entire city or open to individuals outside of city limits. But in terms of reimbursement for your CDBG funded activities, we'll be looking for the low to moderate income participants in that activity. So when you're using the area benefit national objective subcategory, the number of beneficiaries will be the number of low to moderate income individuals residing in the area. This is important because if you have a recreational facility, for example, you want to make sure that you communicate to us the individuals that are being served at that recreational facility and where exactly they reside, because that becomes part of how we track whether or not low to moderate income individuals were actually the recipients of service and or the users of the facility. So please be sure to describe the service area in your proposal. Regarding activity goals and outputs, in your application, in your budget, make sure that you are clear in terms of identifying allowable outputs, which are persons, households, or units of housing. So your outputs should be directly related to the proposed activity. I'll say that again. Your outputs should directly be related to the proposed activity. CDBG reimbursements will be tied to measurable outputs and or outcomes. So we mentioned this yesterday in the financial presentation, and this has been mentioned at multiple parts of our training series about how our reimbursements for CDBG funding, this is not an advance of funding. We look at activity performed and we reimburse the activity and or service performed. All of your activity and or service that you're stating that you will be performing has to be tied to some sort of measurable outcome or measurable output that we can track and monitor before, during, and after issuance of funding. So tracking and evaluation, becomes very important, again, before, during, and after. So that demonstrates to us how successful your grant is. The reason being, we ultimately have to report all of this information and track all of our outputs and outcomes with HUD. So they expect to be able to see measurable outputs. And, for those who, as far as HUD is concerned, they don't have the they don't have the closeness or the proximity of being maybe in the area or being in the vicinity of the agency that's providing the service. So that's why it's important from the start to make sure that the activity or service that you're providing can be interpreted by someone outside of your office to say, you know, this agency is doing this. This is how they're going to do it. This is when they're going to do it. This is where they're going to do it. This is how much of it they're going to do. So that that picture can be painted clearly with your outputs or your outcomes and be measured in a data aspect. So a tip for your proposed activity, goals, and outputs is to be prepared to propose and justify your per unit costs based on your proposed outputs. You know, again, your measurable outputs and outcomes are tied to your reimbursements. And more than likely, you will have a per unit cost associated with your respective outputs. So be prepared to make sure that you can justify those costs. And be realistic in your goal setting. You know, that's something that continues to be repeated throughout these presentations. You know, make sure that you're clear about what it is that you're trying to do with your resources. These resources are not unlimited. You know, they can only go so far in terms of carrying out, you know, what you're looking to do. So, you know, make sure that you prepare yourself to have a successful application, have a successful program, and make sure that the numbers that you're proposing, you know, can be attained and can be reached. So, you know, also when that comes to your budget, you know, make sure that when you're determining reasonableness for your request, that you analyze the cost per unit. So, for example, in a funding request, in terms of the number of outputs, if XYZ organization requests $100,000 for a summer program and proposes to serve 25 children each month for 3 months, per child, the cost for the program is $4,000. Per unit cost, the cost per child per month is $1,333. You have to ask yourself, you know, is this a reasonable cost? Because these are the questions that we'll be asking, and we'll be looking to compare that with other, you know, programs to determine cost reasonableness. Regarding public improvement and facility activity. Site control tips. This is an important one. CDA will look to ensure that the applicant has the ability or is showing the ability and can demonstrate sufficient site control, such as having the site either be in the name of the agency or be leased to the applicant. If the site is city-owned, you'll want to include any descriptions of interactions that you may have had with the holding entity. So again, if you have an application for public improvement or facility activities, you need to show us that you have that you have some sort of investment in the respective site or the area that you propose to carry out your activity in. We have seen a lot of applications where that is not specified, and it really affects the picture that's trying to be painted by the agency in terms of where you're going to carry out your activity, because you haven't established where that's going to happen at. So you'll want to make sure that you've described the areas or shown that you have control of those respective sites. So this was mentioned not yesterday, but at Tuesday's training regarding when we talked about construction items and things associated with public improvement and facility activities, which are considered construction activities, that projects currently under construction or planning to begin construction earlier than June of 2022 are not eligible for CDBG funding due to a variety of activities that need to occur before a construction activity can begin. So make sure that you're keeping that in mind and that you're keeping in mind the timeline of when you plan to begin construction, because there are steps associated to construction projects that are extensive and they have to be followed step by step, and making sure that all the details are not missed. Regarding your budget for your construction projects or your public improvement and facility activity, which is a construction project, please make sure that you have a professionally prepared construction budget, not a bid. A bid is something that has to occur with CDA approval for your construction project, but prior to a project, you can make the necessary steps to prepare a construction budget. Again, on the topic of public improvement and facility activity, there's an environmental review that's associated with all public improvement and facility activity construction. So if available, make sure that you share any environmental reports, particularly any that include adverse information that you receive, such as potential conflicts with sample specimens, to expedite CDA's environmental review process. So if funded, any construction work or closing on a site acquisition without completion of an environmental review will automatically result in the rescinding of your CDBG funding. So you want to make sure that, if you have any previous knowledge or any indication that the site that you're working on may have an issue or maybe a particular problem in the future, you need to make sure that you share that information with us up front. A tip regarding procurement of your public improvement and facility activities: if funded, please know that the solicitation of a general contractor without CDA's preliminary approval will result in either rebidding the project or the rescinding of CDBG funding. This is an issue that's come up in the past where, again, there are a lot of requirements for CDBG funding, and making sure that CDA is aware of all steps of your project from A to Z and has approved all steps of your project from A to Z is crucial. So oftentimes we've seen activity start on a project that was not CDA approved, not reviewed by staff at CDA, and ultimately either the bids that were secured either had to be put back out there, or ultimately the project had to be the project was unable to move forward because of missteps in those areas. One last note on multiple funding sources. When you have multiple funding sources on projects, on your public improvement and facility activity projects, please note that with the inclusion of CDBG funding, CDBG funding requirements are required not only for our funds, but the funding itself requires that all other sources of funding adhere to CDA and federal regulations. So this is important. So when you throw CDBG funding into the mix, even if your CDBG funding applies to just a small portion of the project, because of those funds being there, those regulations then apply to the entire project, and ensuring that the agency is complying with MBE and WBE Section 3 and Davis-Bacon requirements when applicable. Regarding your activity budget narratives, here are a few tips. So Regarding other funding, this part should always be applicable, and you should be seeking to leverage CDBG funding. CDBG funding should not be the only funding associated with your program. You should always make it clear and show how your CDBG funds will be leveraged and what other funding sources are a part of that project. Again, be realistic in your budget projections. So make sure that you can clearly show how your CDBG funds will fit into your project, and make sure that in regards to activity, your line items in total should be greater than or equal to the proposed CDBG amount. They should not, you should not have more CDBG money than your respective budget allows. Or you should not be requesting CDBG money that exceeds your budget. And lastly, your total expenses should not be more than your total revenue. So, most agencies are nonprofit agencies. So, there should not be a surplus. So here are a few tips. Some of these things were mentioned at our financial workshop yesterday, but personnel salaries, timesheets, conflict of interest forms, secondary employment forms, and equal opportunity approval of new hires will all be required in order for personnel to be paid, whole or in part, with CDBG funding. Your local travel is reimbursed at the rate established by the City of St. Louis, which is currently 51 cents per mile. This rate is subject to change, and in the event it changes, you are notified, but it's something to be mindful of. Also, contracts with professional services, supplies, equipment, printing, subcontracting for professional services will require CDA procurement and contract approval if $2,000 or more for a vendor. So again, procurement is an area that affects a lot of agencies and affects a lot of awarded entities. One thing to note is that $2,000 or more is for that respective vendor. So it's not $2,000 per service, it's per vendor. So if you have a vendor that provides multiple services, or if you've contracted for either multiple services or ordered equipment or items like that, although the respective request may be less than $2,000, if all combined together, if it's more than $2,000, you'll need to make sure that you've gone over your procurement process with, or you've gone over a procurement process with CDA. Regarding the personnel schedule, information from organizational narratives, such as personnel descriptions and resumes, will be automatically inserted into the full or part-time personnel schedule based on your selection. The form will add part-time and full-time salary totals, as well as FICA taxes. So the percent of eligible benefits, such as health and dental, must be less than or equal to the percent of salary charged to the grant. Lastly, the form will insert personnel totals in the activity budget pages. An error will occur if the total exceeds the grant amount. And here are some personnel schedule tips. Your actual salary per pay period should be actual salary per pay period. So the number of pay periods should be number of pay periods in the entire year. And ensure the percent inserted from the organizational narratives section is correct. So oftentimes, you need to be mindful that there can be different pay periods for different organizations. So you'll want to be clear about whether your operating on a pay period that's 26 weeks a year, whether you have 24 pay periods a year, or whether you have 12 pay periods a year. So not inserting, and make sure that you're inserting the total amount paid for each pay period. It's again, everything matches and goes together. So you want to make sure that you specify the distinction of when payments are actually being made. One of the last, and again, I'm sorry, the last common mistake on the personnel schedule is including subcontractors in the personnel schedule. We mentioned that earlier. Do not include subcontractors in your personnel schedule as they are not employees of your agency. Another tip for your personnel schedule for those that are part-time, make sure that you enter the hourly rate and make sure that you enter the total hours for that individual for that position for the entire year. And make sure that you ensure that what was inserted from the organizational narrative section is correct. One of the common mistakes is, a rate can be established for a particular position or a particular individual, but the total hours is not indicated in the application. So we actually see that quite often. So that's something to be mindful of. It's a quick example of a personnel schedule. I'm going to skip over that, but if you take some time and access the slides, you'll be able to see the example of the personnel schedule and just recording of the hours and the rates and how things should look. So there's two examples, one of a part-time and a full-time personnel schedule. But I'm going to skip that. Just remember, only include employees on the personnel schedule, no contractors. Clearly, we're repeating that over and over again because we've seen that a lot. But contractors and consultants should go underneath the professional services line, in your activity budget. And all professional services paid with CDBG funds will require a formal contract that meets CDBG and CDA requirements. So again, these are conversations that you're going to be having if awarded with your program monitor and identifying and clarifying all of these areas. In terms of reimbursement, the vast majority of non-construction programs use a per unit cost or a fixed price for a unit of service completed. Your outputs will provide a basis for your unit of service, and you should have no more than one unit of service per outcome or objective. So again, we talked earlier about tying your outputs to your reimbursements, and you'll want to make sure that your units of service are clear and defined and that they do not make any assumptions. That they include the proper calculations, as you are creating that unit of service in those per cost units. So some examples of units of service include the number of meals delivered to seniors, the number of completed workshops for first-time homebuyers, daily attendance in an after-school program, and community gardens planted. Sometimes we have meal delivery programs for seniors. They identify who's going to be served, when the meals are going to be delivered, how they're going to be delivered, and the number of seniors that are going to be served that day, so on and so forth. And that same ideology applies to workshops. If you say that your output is workshops that you're going to be completing, the completion of a workshop or a training session is your output. So whatever the dollar amount associated with that cost is the reimbursement that you would be eligible for, because you're tying the actual output the workshop to that respective dollar amount. And the same goes for, daily attendance at after school programs or, community beautification programs and or community garden, initiatives, things like that. There are some examples that we've provided later on in the presentation, but just want to be clear about the type of unit of service that you're proposing reimbursement for. So when you're arriving at your per unit cost, make sure that you keep in mind the lifespan of the contract, the frequency of reimbursements. This is important because sometimes all activity isn't equally distributed throughout the year. If you're doing a gardening program, you're not going to be gardening, probably in the months of December or January. And again, that's just, on, for some particular programs, but it's something to keep in mind. Also, you want to keep in mind the total amount of your request or award when you arrive at your per unit cost, and make sure that the costs are reasonable and that your program expenses are eligible. Your units of service must be related to the outputs, but they don't necessarily have to be the same. So for example, if you have an after school program, you could have persons as your output, and you can use daily attendance as your per unit cost. So this is something that, oftentimes for those who are applying for after school programs, you have to keep both of those numbers in mind because the number of persons served daily can fluctuate. And ultimately, when we come to, before that, when you submit a reimbursement, this is one of the things that we're looking at, the number of individuals served, how many served per day. And then ultimately, when we come to monitor your program, if you've been awarded, these are the things that we look at with a closer eye to make sure that you reached your respective goals. These are some examples of the earlier mentioned reimbursement analysis. I'm not going to go through all of these, but they are included on the slides. So we encourage everybody to take some time to kind of put an eye on some of these examples. The application that you submit may be similar in nature to some of the services that are used as examples, and or the type of service that's provided. 4 examples were given regarding the projects that I mentioned earlier. Meals delivered to seniors, completed workshops for first-time home buyers, daily attendance in after-school programs, and community gardens. So, take some time to go over those examples so that when you're crafting your program or when you're clarifying your program, you have a good idea of what your per unit costs are, and they're making sense when you put them in your application. So to kind of wrap up, I'll highlight some common EGRAMS mistakes that we've seen in the past. It doesn't apply to everybody, but they've occurred enough for us to make sure that they're highlighted. Again, make sure that you follow the instructions in the respective section. Just like in the RFP, during the RFP discussion earlier, following the instructions of the respective section is important to make sure that you're capturing all necessary information. Please do not try to work around the system. Please do not try to, do anything that will, give you a quote unquote, competitive advantage, or please don't try to, just not really take the time to complete your application. At this point, the application is live and active. So CDA staff, we are not available to talk with anybody about the application or give any pointers or insights or anything like that. But the way the application in the RFP is set up, you don't need that. The application is clear and specific enough that if you make the time available to go through the application and answer the questions, you'll have enough time and information within that application to complete all of your questions and submit it on time. Another common eGrams mistake is if you are making revisions to your proposal, make sure that you're hitting that update button and make sure that you're saving your information. Sometimes you can go into eGrams, and if you get to making adjustments and making updates and putting information in and you don't properly save it, you'll lose your information. Another common eGrams mistake, this is a big one also, having multiple people using the same username. If you are going to have more than one person having access to your application and more than one person having involvement in your potential award, make sure that those individuals have their own login name and make sure that they have their role completely identified in terms of what role that they play in that application, whether they're the project director, whether they're an authorized official, whether they are your executive director. You know, eGrams is set up so that more than one individual can access an application, but we often have situations where someone is responsible for a certain portion of the application. They have a general title for their, or they have a login, and you know, maybe they're completing it for, maybe the executive director has a login and someone else logs in using the executive director. They complete that information, and then there's an issue, and we talk to the executive director and they say, well, I don't know, my grants person does that. If your grants person is going to do that, please make sure that they have their own user ID. What often also happens is turnover. You'll see someone at an organization who is the grant monitor, and they were the only person who was completing the application, and then someone else contacts us and says, person ABC used to work here, they're no longer here, can I have their password, can I have their access to the application? We cannot provide you access to that person's account or their application. You would have to make sure that you have your own user ID and profile, that you submitted that to us, that we've approved it, and then we've given you access to that application. Waiting to the last minute to resolve validation errors. This is one of the number one reasons that applications don't get submitted at the deadline, is because for whatever reason, there is a delay in the completion of the application, or there's, you know, errors that are genuinely ran into that haven't been resolved. And we're giving you 30 days for your application for a reason. I don't expect that everyone goes out today and, you know, starts on their application, but with the application being due towards the end of August, if you wait until the last minute, you're more than likely not going to be able to have a successful application. There's going to be areas that are incomplete. This is not an application that you can complete in a day or 2 days or 3 days. So make sure that you take enough time to go over your application. In the event that there's errors, you have time to resolve those areas. Number 6, forgetting your username and password. This happens often because a lot of times some of those individuals who maybe are applying for, or who have applied in the past, maybe that you have a username and a password that you've forgotten. But you can typically find your user, or you can if you have your username, you can simply put that in and, you know, request that you forgot your password, and eGrams will send you a updated password or a question to access your account to the email address that's on file. Another quick tip is, if you are trying to log into eGrams and you type in the wrong passcode a certain number of times, you'll be locked out. If you wait 15 minutes, you'll be able to log back in. Sometimes we get these panic requests that oh, I'm locked out of egrams, I put the wrong password in a few times, just wait 15 minutes and then you'll be able to put in the correct password. If you've forgotten your password though, we recommend that you go the route of resetting your password first so that you can establish a new password and have access to your account. Not uploading attachments early. Make sure that the supporting documents that need to go along with your application are uploaded and included. And sometimes you'll get to the end of the application and realize that maybe you need to change something, but make sure you're doing that as you go along. Not following procedures for questions and expecting an immediate response. So we do have an avenue for questions that are submitted to egrams, and it's egrams support at stlewis-mo.gov. So this is the avenue for if you have a question regarding or a technical question resolving your egrams application. So this is not the avenue for general questions regarding CDBG, and vice versa. If you have, we have our CDBG avenue for questions associated particularly with the RFP. That's not the area to send questions related to your egrams account. So we check that often. So please make sure that your questions, if you have any questions that are sent to those email addresses, just make sure that you allow for a little bit of time before we make a response. We try to make sure that all responses are given in a reasonable time, but expecting an immediate response within the next 30 seconds or the next minute, that probably doesn't. That's probably the wrong expectation to have. Not understanding and using the correct roles in egrams. So if you are the person who's going to be responsible for creating the application and you're going to be responsible for the overall development of the project, you need to be, that respective role needs to be properly assigned to you. Sometimes we get people who say, well, I do one function or I do this, but I don't need to do something else. But they're listed underneath the wrong role, or they're listed as the programmatic entity, and they're trying to submit financial. Well, this becomes later on after you are awarded a contract, but sometimes from awardees there becomes an issue of the individual associated with programmatic access, and then the individual associated with financial reporting access. But all of that can be clearly designated up front. Just make sure that your project director is given access to complete the application, and make sure that if there's multiple parties completing that application, that they all have access to your application. Ultimately, the responsibility lies with whomever is assigned the project director. Those are the individuals that will have access to submit application. Make sure that that's clear as you are assigning, if you are assigning different roles and titles and responsibilities during the application process. And lastly, not updating a prior year proposal. If you are an entity that has applied for funding in a previous year and you were successfully awarded, you can carry over a certain amount of that information, but you will need to update it. If you just carry over the information, it's not automatically updated. So you'll need to make sure that whatever was carry over is still applicable in this current year. So that's all I had at this time. We'll now open up for any questions and provide any answers.
Okay, so it looks like there's one question. They're inquiring about whether they can rehab their health facility. And it sounds like it's located in a low to moderate income area. So the first place you would need to look at is the RFP to determine if, I mean, that would generally fit under public facilities and improvements, which is considered a priority. And so, so if it fits a priority, that means it is potentially an eligible activity. So that potentially is a activity that we could fund. You know, obviously it's based upon the success of your application, but it is an eligible activity.
Okay, I see another question regarding how do we identify the city's priorities? That information is included in the RFP. So if you take a look at the RFP, you will see the activities that are priorities for the city.
And another question is, they're asking about if they can view the scoring sheets. I believe when you enter into eGrams and there's something called show documents. I believe there's an option where you can actually click on the rating sheet and it shows you the rating sheet. I'm not sure. I can double check that, but I believe worst case scenario, we could possibly upload that onto the CDA website if that option is no longer available. Is that a fair assumption, Justin?
Well, if you're asking about the individual score for an agency that was previously awarded, you would need to contact CDA directly on that. We don't post that on the CDA website, but you can definitely contact CDA if you've been awarded in the past and you're wanting to know your score.
Then I was interpreting that as if they just wanted to see a general, like a blank rating sheet, just to see how we rate.
No, this question says, can previous applicants receive the scoring results from previous applications?
Okay. I see. I misread that question. So I guess obviously we're not posting that on the website. So again, you should contact CDA to get that information. Okay, it looks like there's another question. Can you recap the different roles of the activities completed in the application? I don't seem to fit in either mentioned. Is there just a data entry role? So the main one that we were talking about is the project director, who is the author of the application and has the power or the capacity to assign other users to work on different parts of the application if necessary. My suggestion is to find something that most closely resembles your role. So for instance, if you more deal with programmatic stuff, find the role that best deals with programmatic stuff. If you're more dealing with the financial stuff, find the role that addresses financial stuff. I know there are a lot of options, so my suggestion is just find the one that best fits your role.
And you'll find that when you go to eGrams, and if you're already registered in eGrams as an applicant, you're going to ask what role do you serve in your organization, and then there's going to be a list of respective roles, and there's a respective definition with those roles in the application, or excuse me, within eGrams. Because, for example, there's one of the roles says project director, one role says authorized official. So if you're an authorized official with the agency, that means you can look at the application, maybe even answer or complete certain parts of the application, but the project director is the individual who's responsible for pushing the submit button on the application. Sometimes we get executive directors contacting us and they'll say, well, I'm the executive director. I'm supposed to be pushing the submit button on the application. Well, you have to make sure that you are, you have that designation within eGrams, that you've gone to eGrams and that you've associated yourself with the appropriate title to have the rights to push that submit button.
Okay, and there's another question. Does the program have to be an existing program? How much data or proof of concept is expected?
Does it have to be an existing program? How much data or proof of concept is expected? No, the program does not have to be an existing program. However, you do need to be able to answer the questions within the RFP. I can't necessarily answer the question that says how much data is needed, but in terms of proof of concept, you should be able to go through the RFP and provide answers for all of the questions that are asked. Sometimes we have agencies that are up and coming and they themselves are not completely clear on what they want to do. So they are just kind of putting an application out there to see what they can get. That's not necessarily what we recommend. We want you to make sure that your agency has a clear idea of a program, whether it's existing or not, and that you've ironed out all the parameters from A to Z in terms of how the applicant is going to carry out that agency and provide a detailed narrative of the impact that program is going to make, as well as the outputs, what you expect to be reimbursed for, so on and so forth. So that looks like all the questions that we had.
I believe so.
I'd like to thank everybody for taking time today to tune in and participate in our eligibility and best practices narrative. And thank you all for the questions as well. All of our presentation materials is currently available on the CDA website along with the RFP. And we look forward to receiving any questions or any feedback via the respective channels. I'll say it one more time before we leave. The deadline for the RFP is August 27th at 4 p.m. and all applications are submitted via eGrams. So we thank you again and have a nice day.